In this video, we're going to be looking at one of the big challenges that happens from time to time in SQL Server, or actually any SQL database, and that is the challenge of adding or subtracting a column, or even updating a column. So in this example, what you see is we create a table. We have a column called full name. We insert some data. We select star from that data. Then we realize, hey, what we want to do, and this happens quite often, is let's create a first name and a last name column, or columns, I should say. Then we select star from that, and we see, okay, we get the null values, and we're like, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to break up these full names into first and last names, and then we're going to remove the column full name, as you see, and we see the final result. This is actually a very simple example. It's not always this simple in, production environments, or any environment for that matter. And it's actually very common. Again, this is not just something common in SQL Server, though SQL Server does come up quite a bit. So there's just a couple of notes that I have. This is, first of all, don't feel bad if this happens in your environment. It seems counterintuitive because, in general, when it comes to SQL databases, it's typically what we think of as a fixed schema, right? So we don't really think about changing the schema of tables very much. That's, like, for instance, with MongoDB, this would be pretty straightforward. We would say, okay, we're just going to start storing values as first name and last names, right? And we might not go back and update old documents, or we might do that, but it would be very straightforward. It's a little bit different when it comes to SQL Server, right? Or it comes to another SQL database. So, but it is more common than you'd think, and it happens in quite a few environments, quite a few different companies, and of course, also it happens with all kinds of different backends. So don't ever feel bad about that. I will say, in the case of SQL Server, and probably other databases as well, actually MySQL as well, I would definitely be careful about the log, okay? And the reason why I say that, now in this example, it's very simple because we have 4 values, right? But let's suppose we had millions of values, right? And let's suppose we were adding 5 columns. Let's suppose we weren't dropping anything or altering anything. Really what we're doing here is we're altering full name into 2 different columns. That's really what we're fundamentally doing. But let's suppose we were adding 5 columns. And let's suppose we were going to put dates in those 5 columns. In fact, the previous week's video was derived data. So let's say we were adding derived data to our table based on existing data. Well, in an environment in which our log is very, let's say, restricted in terms of how it can grow, that could cause some serious problems. In fact, I can think of one production issue related to that that I saw. This is like 6 or 7 years ago. But it was one of those things where they were updating a column to, I believe it was, get rid of all of the null values and set it to a default value, and that added cost. All of those transactions were occurring. So it's one of those things that just keep in mind that definitely paying attention to log is important. And typically speaking, again, there are exceptions to this, but the log may not be managed in all environments the same. So let's say that we have a sandbox, we have a QA, we have a pre-production, and we have a production. We might be tighter with the log in, let's say, pre-production or QA than production. Or let's hope on some level. For sure. So we might see problems in those environments that we don't see in production, or worse, we might see problems in production that we don't see in the lower environments. We might have some hackery going on. That happens a lot, and again, don't feel bad it happens at your company, but people will experience issues in QA, and they'll go in and they'll do a quick hack that will solve the problem. The problem, though, is they're not going to do that quick hack in production because they don't have access. In fact, that's it's funny, but that's one of the things that annoys me when a developer asks, hey, could you just really quickly give me access to QA so that I can, quickly make a configuration update? And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, what happens if we deploy to production and you haven't made that configuration update? Like, that's not going to apply to production. So, but it happens. They do ask these type of things. So it's one of those things we definitely want to be aware of how each environment it manages that log, because that is more than likely going to be, if there are issues, that's where it's going to come up. The other thing as well is we definitely want to review the transaction. For instance, if I saw one like this, I would want to pay attention to the order of operations. And the reason we would hope this never occurs is somebody might be putting stuff together in development and they're just kind of testing things around. But when they put the script together, let's say in this case, it would be like, let's suppose that they ran the drop column before they ran the update. And many of you see what would happen. Well, the update's going to break, right? And so I've seen this as well where, yes, in testing, they had the right script, but when they checked in the script, they changed the order for reasons I don't understand, but that's what happened. And so when it ran in another environment, well, it wiped out all of the data before it could make the appropriate updates. So basically, in that case, what we would have to do, well, I mean, all of these names would be gone, right? So we'd have the ID and we'd have these null first and last names, but we wouldn't have a full name to set them to. So we'd have to restore the database. Or, of course, in some environments, and it's true, it is kind of hackery itself, but they'll save a copy of the table if they're doing a table update like this. But also keep in mind, if you save a table copy, which is, again, very effective, by the way, if you do that, one of the things I'll say is you also need to be sure about the log, because think about it, you're creating another copy of those data, so that also will have an effect. And then finally, one final note about these type of updates, if we're doing them, and that is when we're, as I just mentioned, let's say, depending on the order and doing table backups, one thing that we can also do, if let's say we're adding 5 columns to a table where there's a unique ID, we might consider adding a new table and linking to that ID. So let me give you an example of this. Suppose that we have a table with a unique ID called Social Security number, or let's just say identification number. And we have all this different information related to that identification number. So we might have the person's name, the person's address, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And let's suppose we decide that we are going to add their favorite color as well. Now we could add a column to that table and say favorite color, right? But we could also create another table called details, right? And we could link the unique ID or the identifier, I should say, to the favorite color. So if we're going to add more details, we could have a table of details. So that is another option. That does not always apply, though. Like, for instance, that could not apply in this case. I mean, I guess we could link it to another table, but then we'd have full name. We'd have redundant data because we'd have full name, and then we'd have first name and last name in another table, and that really wouldn't be useful. But it is something that if we have, let's say, some, like, and I'm thinking personal information, and then we have more detailed information, we might want to keep those separate anyway. And so that's something that we can do, and that's a useful technique. So that's just a few things to think about. I would definitely, again, if you get one thing out of this video, be aware of your log anytime you make changes to columns. Expect some complexity. I also didn't mention foreign keys and primary keys, but if it involves any of those, oh man, it's going to be a headache, because then you're going to have to make changes to other tables before you make changes to the current table. In fact, yeah, I forgot to mention that, but that's also another headache. But the big outages that I've seen related to these type of changes, almost always, I would say 90% of them involve the log. So even though it's not something we should be doing all the time, changing columns in SQL, don't feel bad when it happens, because it does happen more often than you'd think.